Recent spoilers from The Young and The Restless suggest that Kane Ashby is no longer merely reacting to threats from the Newman family, but actively crossing into a far more dangerous emotional and strategic space, one defined by fury, desperation, and a growing sense that he has been cornered with no honorable way out. Kane's anger does not come from greed or ambition alone, but from fear, a suffocating fear for Lily Winters and the twins, a fear that Victor Newman has deliberately cultivated and weaponized. By convincing Kane that his family's safety depends entirely on surrender, Victor has done what he always does best: turned love into leverage. The idea that Lily and the children are in immediate danger has pushed Kane past rational calculation and into a mindset where retaliation feels not only justified, but necessary. This is not the cold, measured businessman fighting for control of an empire. This is a father who believes the rules no longer protect him, and who therefore no longer feels bound by them. Victor's manipulation is especially insidious because it presents itself as inevitability rather than coercion. By insisting that the only way Kane can save his family is by surrendering Newman Enterprises and empire, Kane wrested away through artificial intelligence rather than brute force. Victor reframes the situation as a moral test rather than a power struggle. Kane is told that if he resists, he is choosing ambition over family, and if he complies, he proves his worth as a husband and father. Yet this framing ignores the reality that the danger itself is manufactured. Kane is not responding to a natural crisis, he is responding to a threat created by Victor's influence and shadow power. That realization is what fuels Kane's rage, because it forces him to confront the truth that no matter how intelligent or innovative his methods were, he is still being dragged back into Victor Newman's world, where dominance always outweighs fairness and fear is the preferred currency. The February 5th episode brought this tension into sharp focus through Kane's explosive confrontation with Adam Newman. What began as an argument about loyalty and responsibility quickly revealed itself as something far more volatile. A clash between two men shaped by the same patriarch but hardened in very different ways. Adam's warning that Kane should never even consider endangering the Newman family was meant as a boundary, a line drawn in the sand. Instead, it landed like a provocation. To Kane, Adam's words sounded less like caution and more like hypocrisy, coming from a man who has benefited from Victor's ruthlessness while pretending to stand above it. Adam may see himself as protecting his family, but Kane hears only another Newman insisting that his pain is acceptable collateral damage. That moment does more than escalate tempers, it crystallizes Kane's belief that the Newman family will always close ranks, always protect their own, and always leave outsiders to suffer the consequences. From that point on, the idea of revenge stops being abstract. If Kane cannot win by negotiation and refuses to surrender by submission, then retaliation becomes the only remaining language Victor might truly understand. The question is no longer whether Kane will strike back, but how and against whom. Genoa City is filled with Newmans, each representing a different vulnerability, a different emotional pressure point. Kane does not need to destroy the entire family to send a message, he needs only to make them feel what he has been forced to feel. The threat of violence, especially the threat of abduction, looms large precisely because it mirrors the tactics already used within this storyline. Victor's figurative kidnapping of Lily, removing her agency and freedom under the guise of protection, set a precedent. Mariah Copeland's kidnapping of Dominic Winters pushed that precedent into horrifying reality. With those events already etched into the narrative, the idea of a third kidnapping no longer feels excessive, it feels like escalation. The possibility that Kane might resort to kidnapping is disturbing not because it would be unprecedented, but because it would represent a complete moral collapse for a character who once prided himself on being different from Victor Newman. Kane has always defined himself in opposition to the Newmans' ruthlessness, positioning his intelligence and innovation as cleaner, more ethical paths to power. Yet the more Victor tightens the noose around Lily and the children, the more Kane begins to resemble the very man he despises. Refusing to return Newman Enterprises becomes not just a business decision, but a psychological rebellion, a refusal to let Victor rewrite his identity as a subordinate who folds when threatened. In that context, kidnapping becomes less about cruelty and more about symmetry, an attempt to force Victor to negotiate from the same place of fear and uncertainty. This is where the storyline gains its darkest resonance. Kane is not acting out of pure malice, he is acting out of a warped sense of justice. He believes that if the Newmans experience real loss of control, they will finally understand the cost of their actions. The danger, of course, lies in the fact that once such a line is crossed, there is no guarantee of return. Kidnapping is not a bargaining chip that can be casually placed back on the table. It is a point of no return. One that risks transforming Kane from a man fighting to protect his family into a villain defined by the harm he causes others. The irony is devastating. In trying to save Lily and the twins, Kane may be setting in motion events that ultimately endanger them even further. Fan speculation reflects this unease. Many viewers question whether the show truly needs a third kidnapping storyline, wondering if repetition risks diminishing impact. Yet within the internal logic of the Young and the Restless, repetition is precisely the point. Cycles of trauma, power abuse, and retaliation are the lifeblood of Genoa City. Each new iteration is not meant to shock through novelty, but to deepen the consequences of past actions. A third kidnapping would not exist in isolation. It would echo Victor's manipulations, Mura's desperation, and now Kane's unraveling. It would force every character involved to confront how normalized these extreme acts have become, and how easily moral lines blur when fear overrides principle. Ultimately, this arc positions Kane Ashby at a crossroads that feels both inevitable and tragic. He is a man who outsmarted an empire with artificial intelligence, yet finds himself powerless against emotional blackmail. His anger is justified, his fear is real, and his sense of betrayal is profound, but the path he appears to be heading down threatens to erase the very distinctions that once defined him. If Kane chooses to strike back by targeting a Newman family member, it will not simply be an act of revenge, it will be a declaration that Genoa City's oldest rule still holds true. Power corrupts, fear spreads, and no one escapes the gravitational pull of the Newman legacy without paying a devastating price. Speculation surrounding the Young and the Restless has taken a darker and far more personal turn as the question shifts from whether Kane Ashby is capable of retaliation to whom he would choose as the most devastating target within the Newman family. And the answer to that question reveals far more about Kane's emotional collapse than any act of violence ever could. Kane's rage is no longer unfocused or theoretical. It is narrowing, sharpening, and becoming strategic. Driven by the belief that Victor Newman has crossed an unforgivable line by turning Lily Winters and the twins into leverage rather than loved ones. In Kane's mind, this is no longer a business war or even a power struggle, but a survival scenario, one in which morality becomes flexible and desperation becomes doctrine. When a man is convinced that his family's safety depends on obedience to an enemy, the instinct to strike back does not arise from cruelty but from panic. And panic, once rationalized, is capable of almost anything. From a purely tactical standpoint, the list of potential Newman targets is extensive, yet each name carries a different emotional and symbolic weight. Victoria Newman, Claire Newman, and Nikki Newman represent the emotional core of Victor's world, the women whose harm would shatter even his most carefully maintained facade of control. Any threat to them would be a direct strike at Victor's heart, forcing him into a position of helplessness he has spent a lifetime avoiding. From Kane's perspective, choosing one of them would guarantee immediate results, instant leverage, and a visceral reaction from a man who prides himself on never reacting emotionally. Yet this very effectiveness may also make them too obvious, too predictable, and too close to the kind of cruelty Kane still tells himself he is not capable of committing. That hesitation is precisely what makes the alternative targets far more intriguing and far more dangerous. Adam Newman and Nick Newman occupy a different space in the Newman hierarchy, one defined not just by blood ties but by prolonged suffering under Victor's shadow. Targeting Adam would feel like settling an ideological score, punishing the son who understands Victor's darkness yet continues to orbit it. However, Adam's resilience, unpredictability, and capacity for countermanipulation make him a risky choice for someone already operating under emotional strain. Adam is not easily broken, and Kane, for all his anger, is not seeking chaos for its own sake. He is seeking control. Nick Newman, by contrast, represents vulnerability in its rawest form, and it is this vulnerability that makes him the most compelling and disturbing option. Nick's temporary disability and fragile sobriety position him at the intersection of physical weakness and psychological instability. A place where confinement would not merely restrain him, but actively dismantle him. A kidnapping involving Nick would not need overt violence to be effective. The deprivation alone could become its own form of torture. Isolation, forced withdrawal, and the constant fear of relapse would transform captivity into an internal war, one that plays out silently and relentlessly. For Kane, this choice would not be about inflicting pain for pleasure, but about creating a mirror image of his own suffering. Forcing Victor to watch his son unravel the way Kane feels his own life is unraveling. What makes this possibility even more unsettling is the moral ambiguity surrounding Kane's motivations. He may not fully acknowledge it, but part of him understands that targeting Nick would hurt Victor without requiring Kane to cross the line into outright sadism. He could justify it as a calculated move rather than an emotional outburst, necessary evil rather than an act of vengeance. Yet the distinction is fragile, and Kane's increasing isolation only weakens it further. The more he feels shut out of the truth, the more he suspects that even Lily herself may be complicit in Victor's strategy, whether knowingly or not. If Lily is participating in Victor's plan, or even tolerating it for the sake of safety, Kane's sense of betrayal deepens into paranoia, leaving him unable to trust anyone fully, including the woman he is supposedly fighting to protect. This erosion of trust is critical, because it reframes Kane's potential actions not as calculated villainy, but as a breakdown in perception. When a man believes everyone around him is either lying or being manipulated, he stops seeking clarity and starts seeking leverage. The idea of an eye for an eye becomes comforting in its simplicity, offering a clear moral equation in a world that has become unbearably complex. If Victor threatens Kane's family, Kane threatens Victor's. If Lily is endangered, Nick becomes endangered. In Kane's mind, this symmetry restores balance, even as it quietly destroys it. The tragedy of this arc lies in the inevitability it suggests. Kane may believe he is acting out of love, yet every step he takes pulls him further away from the man Lily once believed in. A kidnapping, especially one involving Nick, would not simply escalate the Newman-Ashby conflict, it would permanently alter Kane's identity within Genoa City. Once that line is crossed, there is no version of the story in which he emerges unscarred, no clean resolution where intentions outweigh consequences. Even if the act succeeds in forcing Victor's hand, the cost would linger, reshaping relationships, trust, and self-perception long after the immediate crisis ends. For fans, the question is not merely whether Kane is capable of such an act, but whether the narrative is ready to confront the fallout of a man choosing desperation over restraint. A Nick-centered kidnapping would push the storyline into darker psychological territory, exploring addiction, vulnerability, and the quiet terror of losing control over one's own mind and body. It would also force Victor into an unfamiliar role, that of a father who cannot intimidate or negotiate his way out of fear, only endure it. In that sense, the storyline becomes less about shock value and more about consequence, less about spectacle and more about erosion. Ultimately, accepting that Kane might resort to kidnapping is not an endorsement of his actions, but an acknowledgement of how thoroughly he has been cornered. When every avenue of reason has been blocked by manipulation, and every appeal to fairness dismissed by power, desperation becomes a kind of logic all its own. Kane may tell himself he is simply playing Victor's game, matching threat with threat, but the truth is far more painful. He is losing the ability to distinguish between survival and surrender, between protecting his family and destroying himself. And if Nick Newman does become the victim, it will not mark Kane's victory, but the moment he realizes that an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind, trapped in a cycle of fear that no one, not even Victor Newman, can truly control.